Okay. A little bit of housekeeping. Please mute while there are presentations, just so we don't get a lot of background noise on the recording. If you have questions, feel free to put up your hand, unmute, ask verbally, or ask in chat. I think Leslie will be monitoring the chat and possibly Rachel as well. And we will try to get to them. Also, here's a QR code for the notes document, and there's also a short URL. And please fill in your name, affiliation, location, and feel free to add any comments, questions, take notes in the collaborative notes document. Let us know if you can't access that or if you have any problems with it, and we'll try to fix it in the background. But hopefully you should be able to edit that. Okay, let's move on to the session goals and rationale. Leslie.
Okay, so I just put a few slides together to set the scene, and this is a kind of a map I stare at many times during my days. And if you want a fun fact, you'd think there'd be 24 zones, but there are actually 38. My point is that for Canberra, I'm in AEDT, UTC plus 11, and about the only other group that shares that time zone is in Eastern Siberia. That's when it's daylight hours, and if it's in winter in standard hours, I also share with Papua New Guinea. So to be blunt, if we have a group forming together and you fill out a poll for what's the most popular time that people in the group want, you can imagine I lose out consistently. And it's kind of interesting, and it's an observation I make, that pre-COVID, Australians did do a lot more participatory work in international groups, particularly in setting standards and in getting into travel. But to go to meetings where we were discussing things that, set standards or best practices, protocols, and we've never achieved that pre-COVID level of participation. And so when we went virtual, we really suffered what I call the tyranny of the time zones. And yet going forward, I think we really need to get serious and address this. So the goal is to see if we can work out, better ways of doing this. And this session also, just so you're aware, because we've put the links to those documents, at the last ESIP meeting in July, Stephanie, Jens and I did something on how we can make meetings, big meetings, conferences, etc., work virtually and enable virtual participation. So this is a carry-on from that, because some of the techniques will carry across, but we're really focusing on the regular meetings. And part of the reason is also that on Thursday we've got a session on ESIP International, because in recent months there's been requests by Europeans who want to join ESIP. So if that happens, it then means we need to seriously think about our clusters and how we can get them to work across initially, in the short term, Australia and Europe and the US. But as ESIP's reputation grows, I'm sure we're going to also need to start considering more time zones in Asia and South America. Next. So, as I said, it's about how we can run effective collaboration in these working groups. Again, as Stephanie has highlighted, it's a heads up. We've got a place for you to add your opinion, or if we don't cover a method in either my talk on ESIP or Stephanie's on RDA, you can add it. And we're going to trial this analysis framework on ways work across multiple time zones. So that's another warning. I always like to give attendees a warning of what they're going to get. This is the first time we've tried that. But as I said, figure out better ways of asynchronous collaboration, particularly if ESIP is going to expand into Europe. Next. Okay, and then, as I said, that's the comparison with the ESIP July section. But again, the restrictions I've got there are travel costs, organisational travel bans, for example. Travel to the US is a bit difficult at the moment via some organisations, care responsibilities and health issues. So I think it's an elephant in the room, but we really need to address it. And let's see what we come up with in this session. Next. Okay, so now we're going to go into the short presentations, and we'll go with Stephanie. What do we want to do about questions? Will we do all three?
I was going to suggest if there are any questions or comments at this stage, please make them. Just say. And then I'm happy to do questions after each talk if we want. But that's up to people, really.
Okay, let's do that. Let's keep it informal.
Okay. So any comments or questions at this point? Okay. Just one comment for me. I mean, Mark knows this very well. I was part of the Secretariat of the Research Data Alliance for 9 years. And in those 9 years, I've had probably a handful of meetings that were during my work hours. Like our regular Secretariat meeting was either 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night, midnight, or 7 a.m., 8 a.m. Well, 8 a.m. was actually pretty good, but it was never during the times that I normally like to work. So, yeah, I feel your pain and everyone else's. Okay, so talking about the Research Data Alliance. Now, I've got a bit of an intro about the Research Data Alliance. Hopefully that's not going to bore everyone to tears. So the Research Data Alliance is a large international member-based organization which aims to build the social and technical bridges that enable data sharing and accelerate data-driven innovation worldwide. It has about 16,000 plus individual members from over 150 countries, and it's made up by a lot of people from different backgrounds, but a lot of them are researchers, scientists, data professionals. There are other people as well. And it's basically discipline and domain agnostic. So there's also, and I just wanted to highlight not just 16,000 people, but also there are 35 plus regions involved. So regions can be individual countries, but can also be things like East Asia or Europe or things like that. So there's a lot of overlapping places, but they basically span the globe. So I think RDA has pretty much members on every continent except Antarctica. And RDA members do a lot of the things that a lot of us want to do as well. So collaborate across the globe in groups made up by volunteers. And that's important because no one gets paid to do this work. It's all volunteer work. They tackle infrastructure data sharing challenges, want to exchange knowledge, share discoveries, talk about barriers, solutions, explore and define policies, test and harmonize standards, and generally enhance and facilitate global data sharing and reuse. So these are all non-trivial problems and non-trivial things that they try to work on. And they're also not things you can just knock out in one meeting. So the community-driven groups often run for several years. So it's a long-term commitment if you're trying to work on these groups. RDA is also supported by a bunch of governance bodies. And these are also, I don't want to go into much detail, but these are also made up by people from very different regions. And in fact, particularly the Techno Advisory Board and the Council need to be balanced in terms of geographical coverage. These bodies are supported by the RDA Secretariat, which is also globally distributed, that basically does administration operations. So what I'm trying to say here is RDA is a large global organization with a lot of people trying to work together on a lot of different things across a lot of different time zones. So And a couple of things that are being done and have been done in RDA. So, for example, the RDA Secretariat, which has members from Europe, Australia, and North America at this point, they have regular weekly meetings. And what basically happens is, when I was part of the Secretariat, I think that hasn't changed. A time gets picked that sort of works for as many different time zones as possible. So that could be early morning in the Americas, afternoon in Europe, late evening in Australia. And the problem is, the good things are everyone's there. Everyone can hear the same thing at the same time. Everyone can technically have an equal say. Excuse me. And you can discuss issues like in a normal meeting quite quickly, and you're staying connected with people because you actually see them on screen. The disadvantage is it's always out of work hours for some participants, and my experience is that half the people are super tired because it's either super early for them or super late. So one group, the lucky ones for whom this is the middle of the day, for them it works quite well, but everyone else is super tired. And also, what I didn't put there, a lot of things that come out of the meetings that need to be done then sit in someone's inbox for quite a while until they come back to work, or they do it even more work out of hours. So that's not so great either. The Technical Advisory Board, which covers even more time zones, they do something that are called semi-synchronous. So they repeat meetings at, I think, 2 different times. And communication between the meetings can be either through a person who attends both or through meeting notes or both. Advantages are, at least the meeting times are not quite as bad. So normally one of the 2 meeting times should work for everyone reasonably well. And you at least see some of your colleagues. But the problems are, if you need to make decisions, for example, TAB reviews a lot of documents and things like that. So meeting 1 has some comments. Meeting 2 resolves these, but has some questions or whatever. They need to go back to meeting 1, and that's actually quite slow and cumbersome, and may mean that you actually cycle back from meeting 2 to meeting 1 for a couple of times to resolve issues. And also, the other thing is, you basically meet your own time zone people, but you don't necessarily meet anyone else. So there's a bit of a fracture throughout the meeting. And the other thing is, very often one meeting is much bigger than the other, and that makes the smaller meeting feel a little bit like they're less considered, if that makes sense. So there's a bit of a power balance thing going on as well. A lot of working and interest groups work synchronously, but because a lot of members can't make it to a regular time slot, what happens is that they basically try to do a lot of work outside of meetings via email, meeting notes, to-do lists, documents. Sometimes they also share recordings or transcripts with other people so that they know what's going on. So if you're in a meeting, you can contribute. That's great. But you can also contribute offline, which is also good. Again, you stay connected with the people who show up on a regular basis, and you can get a lot done and resolved during those meetings. However, it's pretty much impossible for people outside of those time zones to attend. And in particular, these are even all volunteers. So not everyone is willing to join a meeting at 3 a.m. to do some volunteer work. There's also a danger of in-groups, so that the people who meet make the decisions and everyone else just hears about them. While you can contribute offline, it feels harder to contribute without attending meetings and knowing what exactly is going on. And also, there's a need for facilitation and follow-up by the people in the group with the group. And RDA actually had a program called Tiger, which provided facilitation support to working groups for exactly that. And that was really, really helpful. Plenary sessions in RDA are basically like a plenary is like a conference. So there are sessions, but the sessions are all working sessions where the groups come together and try to do stuff. They focus a lot on collaborative session notes and recordings being provided shortly afterwards. So again, if you can come to the plenary, which incurs a registration fee, you can contribute to the work of the group. And it's actually a great way to find out what groups are doing and to get connected and stay connected. But again, time zones are not your friend. Recordings, yes, you can watch them, but if you watch the 1.5 hour recording of a meeting to find out what's happening in the meeting, that's not very efficient and not fun. And the collaborative session notes can be fantastic, or they can be just not very great, depending on what the group is doing in their session. Okay. Other things that we've been trying to employ a little bit is fully asynchronous. So having no meetings, which means everyone's basically equal and just interact through written documents and other communication channels such as Slack or Discord. Advantages, everyone can do whatever they want, whenever they want, but it's difficult to resolve issues quickly, difficult to stay connected and create a feeling of community and of a joint goal and joint task. And it needs a lot of facilitation and coordination. One thing Leslie mentioned is hub meetings. We actually have a hub meeting for this particular ESIP meeting, which is a fully virtual Australian one. So we've just brought together a couple of people from Australia who are attending, and we will be watching recordings and discussing them locally. So they can be either you can either have a set of hubs that are pretty much equal, or like we do with this one, there's a main event, the ESIP meeting, and then there's a satellite event, which is in this case the Australian hub. That combines some advantages of actually being in person with advantages of virtual meetings. So you can actually, if you do a local in-person hub, you can actually meet other people. And that was really great at the last one. You still have a little bit of travel, but it's much, much less. If I have to go across town, that's much easier for me than get on a plane to fly to Boston or wherever the meeting actually happens to be. It can make use of time zones. So some of you may be familiar with book sprints. That's a general similar idea. You just have local meetings that basically pass work on from one time zone to the next. That can be very efficient. And you can also, if you have local hubs with overlapping time zones, they can connect even outside the times of the main meeting or other hubs. So they can actually connect between them. So we were thinking we could try, if there was an Asia hub, we could connect with some of them for some of the time. Disadvantages, if you're a satellite hub, particularly if you're a small one, you may feel like you're a bit of an appendix to the main meeting, and it's a little bit difficult to be heard and seen. It can be difficult to resolve issues across hubs. And again, you're basically planning a mini event, so it needs event planning and facilitation. So a few thoughts, and they're not rocket science, I don't think, but they're things that we've been thinking about. So none of the sort of synchronous or synchronous-ish meetings are really inclusive. Some work well enough for enough people to make them succeed. In particular, if you have a very unbalanced distribution, if you have 20 people from the US and one from Europe and one from Australia, then the time zone to be picked will most likely be friendly to 20 people, and it's just bad luck for the other two. But that works well for the 20, but it doesn't really work well to integrate the other people and bring in the diversity and the global coverage. Truly global collaboration, I think, is still beyond us, unless you are willing to work at times that are really not convenient. So one thing we've been wondering is how can we be as inclusive as possible, but provide as much interaction and connection as necessary? And that also comes down to what are we actually trying to achieve in the collaboration? So that's one aspect to consider. What are we trying to do? And how can we explore new ways of working together? And that's me.
Questions of Rebecca?
I'm Stephanie, but anyway.
Oh, sorry, Stephanie. Sorry, while you were talking, I've been trying to get Rebecca in, and she has finally arrived.
That's okay, but it's unfair to let her arrive and say questions for Rebecca, and she doesn't know what's going on.
Yeah, sorry about that, Stephanie. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, Stephanie, that was great. A nice summary of existing approaches. Just to add to your few thoughts, it struck me that on any of the ones that involve asynchronicity, really good facilitation makes a difference. You know, if there's somebody who owns it, who's really making sure that the information gets transferred, people follow up on their actions, that people are included, that seems to be a really critical piece. Yes. And then just to thought on your truly global collaboration is still beyond us.
Mm.
It's ironic that this has actually occurred because of technology. I mean, people collaborated globally before the internet. It was just very, very slow.
Yeah.
But everybody was equal. It was just letters and well, equal in the fact that they could attend the occasional conference and so forth. But so we're actually a victim of our success in a sense.
Mm. Yeah, that's true. And one thing Leslie mentioned earlier was during COVID, we had a lot more people willing and able to do odd hours. Like I remember we had the virtual plenary, the virtual RDA plenary that was started out as a physical plenary, but was cancelled a week before because that was in March 2020. And I can't remember how many people registered for the virtual plenary. It was free, so that was one thing, but everyone was in lockdown at home. No one had to go anywhere, take kids to school or whatever. So a lot of people had a lot of time at odd hours to join the virtual plenary. It was the biggest we ever had. It had way more registration than any of the others. Not that people came to many sessions, but we had BOFs with 150 people in them, which was insane. It was fantastic. And a lot of people who had never had been exposed to RDA actually managed to come to that. But that's not that was exceptional circumstances. We can't sort of build on that. Like we can't presuppose that's going to happen again. Sorry, Mark, you're muted.
Just yeah.
Okay. I'll hand over to Leslie.
So again, as I said, with the topic of ESIP Europe being on the cards, I thought I'd make this presentation because Australia has had a strong connection with ESIP going back to, I think the first partner from Australia was in 2014. And we actually have 7 Australian partners and 1 New Zealand partner. And so I've just summarised the participation. I'd also just like to qualify and introduce the term family friendly, meaning that if you've got a young family and you're trying to get people to work outside of 8 till 4, it's not really fair. And so that's one consideration. But again, I hark back to what Stephanie said. For some reason in COVID lockdowns, we made it work. But it's not happening, particularly with conferences, and the virtual offerings at conferences these days are getting pretty dismal, such that they're not worth joining. And I just hope meetings don't go this way. So model 1 is we down under just joining the cluster meetings as is and when is, and a couple of good examples of physical samples and the sustainable data management cluster. The advantage is it's only one meeting. But I just wanted to point out to you the issue of having one time zone is like 4 p.m. Eastern time in the US is the best, is like the sweet spot. But you can't have every cluster meeting at 4 p.m. on the days of the week. And to highlight it, if it's at 4 p.m. your time, in January this is 8 a.m. 5 in Eastern Australia, 5 a.m. in the West, and 10 p.m. in Europe. In July, this is the daylight savings impact. It's 6 a.m. Eastern Australia, 4 a.m., but still 10 p.m. The other issue, which a lot of people don't realise, is that the daylight saving changes take place over 4 to 6 weeks in March, April, and October, November. And so it's almost like for every regular meeting, particularly building standards or protocols, I have to deal with, I think it's 6 time changes per year, because what happens is we don't all change out of daylight saving at the same time. There's a significant, like Australia usually goes first, 2 to 3 weeks later, then Europe, 2 to 3 weeks later, US. So it's actually a nightmare keeping track of where you've got a single time zone. And I don't think people realise that trick over the daylight saving changes. If they'd standardise the timing in the changes, it would help. But as we know, standards are hard to follow. Yeah, I agree with someone putting in the chat that daylight savings is a nightmare. Okay, so next slide, please. This is what we do in the CopDesk cluster. We run one European East Coast US and one West Coast US Australian friendly times. And so everyone gets to meet in what I call family-friendly times. Disadvantage, and I think Mark harked on this, is the chair or someone has to attend both meetings, so you get harmonisation of activities. Less good notes are taken. It's very hard to harmonise. As Stephanie said, listening to 90-minute recordings with a lot of chit-chatter and background noise is pretty boring. And I think AI transcriptions are really helping. And in some groups I work with, it's absolutely brilliant because at the end of the meeting, you get the transcription. The better ones give you a one-page summary of the key decisions at the meetings and tell you the time in which in the recording where this occurs. So again, if you're doing the recording, you can be really targeted in what you look at, but I'll leave that to the next talk. Next slide, please. Model 3, and we set up parallel clusters in Australia, Europe, US, and organise joint meetings or invite presenters from one cluster to present at another. And the eSIP Information Quality Cluster did that. So we had a ARDC data quality. And although it's not eSIP, but I do know Matt Mayonet comes and reports on it, the RDA PIDs for instruments, which is mainly Europe, NSF identifiers for facilities and instrument group, and the ARDC. And they're all sort of running locally, but we're connecting asynchronously. Oh, are you doing that? Are you doing that? And the classic example is that in the identifiers one, the Europeans and the Australians were totally focused on the identifiers, whereas for the instruments, whereas the NSF group also did facilities. And in Australia, in our group, we've got to the stage where we say, oh my God, we really need to pin down the facilities. And so what this has meant is through collaboration, we can now pick up on all the in-depth work the NSF group did on facilities. And so, as I said, your work is done with an emphasis on local issues, but you place it within an international framework. And you can develop a richer product because all of a sudden you realise what one of the other groups is doing is highly relevant and you can pick up on that. The disadvantage is the chairs of each group have additional work in synchronising, and it's hard to coordinate joint meetings. And so again, as Stephanie said in RDA, the plenaries make the difference where you do have a chance to get together. And the eSIP meetings are the chances where you can get together better, but that requires local hubs and spokes to be set up. And we, in Australia, the Australian eSIP partners would like to thank eSIP for, as in June, we trialled a physical hub where we got together in Canberra. And in this one, we're trialling a fully virtual hub. So watch this space as to whether that will work. I'll also just add another thing. I did talk about AI helping and enhancing, but I have been at some meetings where people attending the meeting request that AI not be used. So that's just another variant. But anyway, there are 3 models currently operating with Australians trying to join ESIP clusters. And I hope you like that. I think that's my last slide. Is it? Stephanie, can you move on?
Sure. Yeah, it is.
Okay. So again, if anyone wants to ask any questions about how we're getting these Australians interacting with the ESIP clusters, let's hear them now.
Just this is useful, and Model 3, I think, is particularly interesting. In the clusters that you've been working with, have you ever run into where, oh, we have a couple Aussies that want to join and we have a couple Europeans that want to join, and then you have a, sort of a clash? Or is it, that was maybe model, I think it was 2.
Model 1, yeah. So that's exactly what happened, because I'm fairly active in the physical samples and the sustainable data management. So when they did put the call out, I said, 4 p.m. is ideal. But unfortunately, it means West Australians can't join.
Right.
It's up to the cluster itself. So again, you've got a soils cluster, and they used to meet at 4 p.m. For some reason, they changed it to an earlier time slot, which translated till 3 a.m., and all the Australians dropped out. So it's kind of the cluster organisers or chairs being aware that, you've got a time zone problem and how you're going to address it. And so with COPDES, we knew that COPDES has people in Europe and Australia, and so that's why we went for 2 meetings. I forgot to add the disadvantages on ESIP itself, because Alicia does try and join in as the community organiser, but it means she has to do 1 out-of-hours meeting a week. And when did we do that?
Yeah. But one point you made that I think is the cluster chairs have to be aware, and I think that's a key thing actually for ESIP. If ESIP does want to be more international, because we default just by nature to U.S. time zones. We bridge. We got 5 to deal with, but usually just 3, and so that's people's natural default. And so if we're going to change that we have to sort of change that attitude, and because people don't even think they can join because it's always been scheduled at 9:00 Eastern or whatever. But yeah, anyway.
Yeah, I don't know whether it was ever communicated to the soils cluster what the impact was of them changing their time, because immediately the Australians dropped out.
Leslie, I had a question. So with this Model 3, where you have parallel clusters, how would you see that scale if you have more regions or more time zones come in? Because I can see that work with 2 clusters and maybe 3, but if you have more and you need to have more, I think the coordination time will get quite complicated, or the facilitation and coordination will get quite complicated.
Okay, so where we do the joint meetings, it's kind of a one-off, and we don't do it all that often. But again, one group has to put itself out. One group has to agree to meet at crazy hours.
Okay.
And that's why we were actually getting together more at the meetings. But there again, with the meetings, that's also why we then started the experiment with the hubs. Yeah, and if people can travel to your meetings, that solves it. But I'm afraid, I don't know about the rest of the world, but travel budgets are diminishing, and political barriers are increasing, and it's getting very hard to get to your meetings.
Yes. I had another comment, and that's, we've been talking about time zones as in, Eastern Standard versus Australian Daylight Saving or whatever. But the other thing is actually the year isn't the same either. So one reason why we have a very, very small hub for this particular ESIP meeting is because it's still school holidays in Australia. So everyone's away on the beach or wherever. And we have hardly any people who are actually around and can join. Whereas, for example, we wouldn't normally, like if we did something with the Northern Hemisphere, we wouldn't organize it in July or August because we know that's the Northern Hemisphere summer and everyone then will be at the beach. So it's not just the times of the day, it's also the rhythm of the year that makes it harder, I think. Yes, beach days in January is yeah, we had 43 degrees here last week. So 43 degrees Celsius, not Fahrenheit. So
yeah, I'd like to say that we had at least 10 people write to me and say they would love to have joined in this meeting, but it's school holiday time. But again, it's forced us to experiment with a fully virtual hub and watch this space to see whether we're still going on Friday.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking there's a lot of things to consider. This is just basically 2 different regions, countries. If we add more, it gets more and more complex. And I think we need some novel ways of working together that do not rely on having to be in the same, even virtual space at the same time. Anyway, any other questions or comments? If not, I'll hand over to Rebecca. Rebecca, apologies. You haven't had an opportunity to introduce yourself. Would you mind doing that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. I was late arriving. I'm Rebecca Farrington. I work for Ozscope, which is Australia's national provider of research infrastructure for the geosciences. So we're an organisation with the same funding stream as ARDC that Stephanie and Leslie are representing today. And I'm the Director of Research Data Systems. So I've attended quite a few ESET meetings over the years and try to participate in the international community. So I was excited by the idea of doing these hubs. I'm based in Melbourne, which is the same city as Stephanie. And yeah, we've done a few virtual things, Stephanie and I. And we were going to try to catch up physically together for this meeting, but it just got too hard because it is January. So I'm here to talk about AI tools. And if you go to the next slide, Steph, that would be great. We just have one slide on this. I think we can all recognise that this space is moving really fast, and there's some already been mentioned, I suppose, in this session, some of the kind of low-hanging fruit that we can use, AI for, scheduling meetings and figuring out time zones as they change throughout the year is an obvious one. And I think we've all been using technology to organise that for quite a while now. But things like the automatic summaries and highlights in effectively real time and transcriptions, etc., are the kinds of things that I suppose over the last couple of years have really come to the fore. But then there's also things like the accessibility, which I suppose hints on us all having different patterns in our lives and different not geological, but geographical locations, and I suppose life stages as well. So depending on how you can ingest the information more efficiently, using AI, we can then modify whether it's a presentation that you listen to sped up or, just the audio or a transcription or just the highlights, etc. Those are the kinds of things we were thinking about. Also, Jens, I wanted to do a shout out for Jens because he's been driving this in Australia, but he is in the Perth time zone, so it's 5 a.m. for him. And he did have a late EGU meeting yesterday, but also the idea of digital first collaboration. So making sure, grabbing all of those artifacts that we have in our meetings that I think, in the past and currently, it's a real skill set. We all know the people in our communities that do great minutes and those that don't, those that can work their minds around the time zones and those that can't. And those are the kinds of things that, if we can leverage AI tools, can really level the playing field and, I suppose, alleviate that load that seems to often fall on, a small group of our community. I think in our chat as well, what I was looking at, I think this is all kind of at the forefront of people's minds in this space. So I'm happy to throw that open for comments and discussions now. Leslie, can I ask, we don't have a session dedicated to discussing this later on in the session, do we? We're hoping to follow this up now with a general discussion. correct? Or Steph?
Yeah, we were going to try Jens develop this framework for us to figure out what are the better ways and the advantages. So we were right now going to. So if no one's got any questions for Rebecca, we want to open up the floor for anyone to discuss another method they may have other than the ones that like Stephanie and I have talked about, and also using AI to really enable digital first collaboration, because I can't emphasize enough how much it makes it easier for me to track things where you go in, you've got this, there's a couple of applications that allow you to do this. And first of all, you've got a, AI summary of about 10 key points from the 90 minutes, the full transcript, and then the ability to link to the video itself, and it tells you where the key points are in the meeting that support what they argue were the key decisions or key points. So if there's no questions for Rebecca, is there anyone who'd like to speak from the floor of another way that they know is doing? Okay, over to you, Mark.
I don't have another way. I think you all covered the gamut really well. But I'm curious about these tools you're talking about. Can you name some? Be specific.
Specific. Sorry, Leslie. Yeah.
I was going to say, are they in those notes? Because I did send a couple. No, there might be notes at the bottom of Jens's slide.
No, we haven't gone into any specificity, and I think one of the Douglases raised that as an issue. So, with different institutions, I suppose that we've got the different countries have different requirements with data sharing, etc. But even in different institutions, we have access to different applications. So I know Jens is at CSIRO and they're very locked down with what they can and cannot use. Ozscope's a not-for-profit, so we're a small organisation that sits outside any large institution, which is kind of, I think, similar to ESIP, where we have a little bit more flexibility in terms of what we can and cannot use in terms of tools. We can kind of set up anything that we deem as sensible and our board agrees to. A lot of our university partners are really restricted. So, I mean, in terms of transcription and whatnot, any of those seem to work, but I don't think there's an actual solution yet. And they change every 3 months too, I suppose.
It's just Leslie was mentioning this tool that would summarize the key points, tell you where in the video they happen.
It's called Fathom.
Okay.
I've just put it in the chat.
Gotcha.
And
that's what
Carl has his hand up.
Sure. And I wanted to, as I finally was able to settle down from my other stuff going on here, but I had noticed probably for the last year and a half or so, as Leslie, I think you alluded to, sometimes the reaction to participants in meetings when the AI transcriber lands in and nobody quite knows who or what it is and what's happening. I think that's a real concern that some people have. But I also wonder, especially around the sort of real-time AI participation versus post-processing of recordings, whether that is potentially a way to address some of the issues with the platform access, enabling particular technologies within meetings where, technologies that might allow post-processing of the recording for transcription and providing those sorts of features may be one option for thinking about how to leverage the AI capabilities, but it's a semi-offline processing to, especially in sort of this liminal period of folks either gaining more or less comfort working in and around AI tools. And I think we're headed in both directions simultaneously. but being able to leverage some of those tools in an offline mode may be one strategy. But the other is being very clear and explicit in vetting and adopting and consistently applying tools that have been identified by the community, by the particular community of participants, as being first having been evaluated in terms of whether it's security and privacy and the anonymity in some cases. So that there's not just a random AI agent showing up in the occasional meetings, but instead adopting a standard AI assistant that has gone through a review and approval process that can help address some of those concerns that folks have around sort of the AI participation in meetings, because I see huge opportunities for being able to leverage AI, for being able to essentially enable improved universal access to the information, discussion, and participation in meetings, where this is an additional dimension for thinking about accessibility in terms of the distribution across time zones. So I think that on the AI front, I think it's absolutely necessary and it has huge opportunities for benefit, but we need to be very thoughtful in the way we leverage it and how we can maximize the benefits while acknowledging the real concerns that folks have around the introduction of AI into our interactions.
Thanks, Carl. Douglas?
And I think some discussion about different models are focusing on those like short events. And we also tried some of the virtual, like long duration workshops that we were too ambitious trying to do it over the 24 hours, have 3 different regions, and each region have 6 to 7 hours of the time. And within the 2 adjacent regions, you have an overlap towards the end of the first region and then the beginning of the second region. So you have the interactions across different regions. And in that way, to have more connectivity across different time zones, but at the same time, allowing the events to happen in the time that probably most suited for the for specific regions. But I think that goes back to probably one of the models discussed before, which is you need to make sure that each time zones or regions have the key facilitators and the information can be shared across time zones for those non-overlapping regions. And I think going more broadly, that thinking of the long, maybe a week-long events, and so how that can be done is also something that requires a lot of the like human resources to make that happen, which to ensure connectivity across different hubs and for that.
Yeah, I agree. And it's not just, it doesn't, like it also needs a specific skill set, I think, to be able to make this happen. Not just people, but they actually really need to know how to do this. Leslie?
Just quickly, the tool, getting back to the tools, as I understand it, Stephanie, correct me if I'm wrong, ARDC has vetted and is using this product called Fathom. And I've just written to Jens, but I don't think he's up yet. We'll make sure we add it to the notes because CSIRO use a different one. So that kind of is an organisational issue. But I'd also emphasise that they're fallible. And I remember looking at one of the ARDC meeting notes and saying, oh, my God, the transcript, was incorrect. And so to me, it's sort of like a tool you use locally. If you were to publish that, somebody really does have to vet those notes and make sure they're accurate. Also, with the sharing of the recordings, I'd like to give a shout out to ESIP, because what ESIP is doing for us in Australia is they are giving us access to the raw recordings, and that's what we'll be listening to this afternoon and tomorrow afternoon, etc. Okay? and with the proviso that they're only made accessible to those that register and are not to be passed on for obvious reasons, because they're not the official ones that ESIP will be releasing in a month or so's time. And we are finding when we do approach some organisations that they're not willing to let the transcripts or the recordings available until, somebody has gone through and cleaned them. And I think the advantage is having access as early as we do to those recordings and transcripts makes a huge difference. So it's just really a comment.
Thanks, Leslie. Any other questions or comments? Or any other suggestions or any other approaches that you've seen, whether they've worked or not, that you might want to talk about?
Well, I want to riff on Douglas's idea of the extended thing. I'm wondering if anybody else has had experience with that. I know it's in a hackathon type context where you're really building a product or solving a coding problem or something. I've seen that happen before, but this context of cluster meetings tend to be check-ins, getting everybody together, what have we done? What are we going to do next? Subgroups break off and do their thing. Has anybody seen this? They're just curious if anybody's else seen this sort of extended sort of approach, because I think that has promise, but it's also, it requires a different level of commitment or a different type of commitment.
Mark, Pitapalooza, which is the predecessor of PidFest, they actually tried that like when COVID was rampant and did like a 24-hour meeting where you could, drop in at any stage. But the general opinion was that it was not successful. It was just too demanding. And certainly PidFest hasn't picked that methodology up. I don't know of anyone else who's done it.
I've heard about it in two contexts. One was a chronobiology, I think, conference that did exactly that, but as a conference. So they basically had, I think, 6-hour blocks with overlaps between different locations. And they actually, I think the keynotes were repeated. So in 2 different time zones so that they would cover as many regions as possible. And book sprints. I've not been part of any, but I've heard of some that have worked quite well. But I think you're right. If you try to do it over a day, the problem is it's super demanding. If you make it longer, then it's a commitment that makes it harder for people to stay on. Like, it's harder for people to stay on. That's a problem we have with virtual conferences as well. While you're in a virtual conference, you're not traveling to a place. So you're not isolated from your other work requirements. So everyone thinks, oh, you're at work, so you just have to do everything, which means you end up having a very long day with a lot of extra work squeezed in your virtual meetings or virtual conference. And I think there might be ways to sort of experiment with that idea, because it can be super, super efficient if you have teams that have clear tasks that you can, like an assembly line that you can hand over from one to the next. That might work. But if you need a lot of back and forth and a lot of interaction, I think it becomes quite complicated. Does that make sense? Yeah, the worst is the conference in your hometown. Yes, you get both. Douglas?
Yeah, another thought I was thinking early on in the session is that there has been a lot of those like asynchronous teaching models, and then there might be something we can also explore and learn from those like asynchronous teaching models. I know that's almost like 10 years ago when I was still at grad school, I went to a teaching conference where they were introducing different technologies and platforms where you can do and that you can post as like kind of stage setting video for the learning module for that specific topic. And then you have some of the small groups working on it in those small hubs, right? That you have that specific group connections, but you have the level playing ground by setting the stage on those issues you're trying to address. So that may be another way to think about for more like short time periods meetings, like cluster meetings. But that may require organizers or the cluster chairs to be organized enough to provide those like common background informations, and then to enable some of those hub discussions, and then reconnect again on those like specific issues that each hub should be talking about, and then leads to decision making that may be related to some of the models RDA has been already used. But I think there's ways we can learn from the online teaching, asynchronous teaching as well.
I think that's a very good point, Douglas. And that is one thing I was feeling a little bit bad about. I used to be part of the computer-supported cooperative work community. And I think in teaching and education and CSCW and other areas, there's probably a lot that we could learn from. I think it's just quite a lot of effort to actually go through it and just try to see what other people have tried. And I've done a bit of a literature search, but I haven't found super much. But there must be things. And I haven't looked at teaching and education in particular. So that's a very good point. Because that there will be things that can be adopted and adapted. Oh yeah, Carl, that's a very good point. So document sharing, yes, SharePoint versus what's the other one? Teams versus Google Docs. Some work for some people. Some organizations restrict access. Trying to get into SharePoint has been a nightmare because my organization doesn't use it, and it's been super complicated when I work with someone at CSRO on stuff. So yeah, that is definitely a problem.
Back to the very intentional selection and recognition of the limitations of whatever choices we make for our collaboration tools, so that we can at least know what the limitations are to the extent possible before foisting it upon collaborators who just can't use them.
Yep. Yeah, that's a very good point. Any other comments or questions at this point? Okay. Leslie, do you want me to move on?
Yes, let's move on.
Okay. So we have done this bit, I think. So,
yep.
And also just to be clear, if you have any further comments, like if you wake up tomorrow morning and say, I wish I should have said that, please put it in the notes. We will definitely read them. Okay. Now what we wanted to do is just present a really simple framework that I think Jens started to put together with, I think, the help of AI, he said, that we could potentially use for looking at different approaches and seeing if we can get a handle on how to tackle them and how to look at them for different purposes. So this is very much very drafty, in fact. And I actually made some changes to it yesterday. But we were thinking of what we would like to look at is different dimensions of the different approaches that exist, and see how they actually work against these different dimensions. And these dimensions may not be complete, and they may not be detailed enough, so anyway, anything in this is basically open for discussion and for change. But the framework that Jens came up with has 6, I think, dimensions. So effectiveness, and that means how have the outcomes that you wanted to achieve been achieved? Are they clear? Is the action item follow through? So does this actually fulfill the purpose of what your collaboration, your work, your meeting has set out to do? Engagement. So things like participation rates, interaction quality can be measured, for example, by feedback scores or other other feedback. Accessibility, that word I'm actually not super happy with. I prefer to call it inclusivity and subsume accessibility in it. But anyway, so inclusivity for remote staff. So for other people anyway, not just staff, but for what is it inclusive for everyone, not just people in the same time zone, same community, etc. So how does this handle time zones, and also things like, is there support for people with additional needs? Efficiency, how fast are you achieving your outcomes? Do you need to rework a lot? Is there additional effort that needs to be made? Like we talked about, coordination, facilitation, risk and resilience. So how reliable is this under disruptions, technical failures, other work jumping in, things like that? And how complex is this? How easy or hard is it to coordinate, to integrate technology? How fair is it? How can this be set up? So that's a couple of things that we have in that framework. Any thoughts or comments on that? Okay. All right. Thanks, Carl. Did you want to elaborate on that?
Sure. I think, and this is something that has certainly come out of my interactions with the Carpentries and sort of the core pedagogical model that they focus on in terms of, and I know that some people have heard me talk about this recently, is this focus on design practices, and particularly universal design, that is intended to maximize inclusive access and participation as a general practice, as opposed to the historic focus quite often on identifying accessibility needs and the specific accommodations needed when a particular participant is needing to engage with our community. If we instead adopt a design framework that by default is inclusive, it can help us in a lot of contexts, including, thinking about the cultural, technological, individual human variability characteristics that we bring into trying to support and grow our community of participants. So yeah, the shift from accessibility to one of inclusiveness, I think, is a really good one.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, Mark. I actually curb cuts? What is a curb cut?
Oh, I was being clever by at least using the other way of spelling curb. A ramp built into the sidewalk, the pavement that allows, it doesn't just help the wheelchair, it helps the person with the baby stroller, or the delivery person with their hand truck, or
the person who sprained their ankle like me. Yes.
Right.
Yeah. I've seen
big thing in building accessible. The big thing in building accessible cities, which is another hobby horse of mine.
Yeah, I've seen that same argument, and it actually works in educational settings. If you make accommodations, for example, for students who have problems with, following schedules, if they're just spoken about, if you have a visual schedule, that doesn't just help the person who has problems processing auditory, but it also helps everyone else because they can see what's going on. So it's a similar argument that there's a lot of things that are considered accommodations, but are actually beneficial for way more people than just the people who, air quotes, need them.
Right. Closed captioning.
Yep. Yes, closed captioning, for example, is another one. Okay. Any other comments on things that on these sort of this framework? Do you think it's a useful thing to have a framework to look at stuff? to look at the way we interact and to look at the different modes of collaboration, meetings, etc.
Yeah, I guess, and maybe this will come out as we get into it. It seems to me that the weight of these different criteria is going to really depend on what you're trying to accomplish. Sometimes it's okay to go slow, and so the asynchronous models are fine. Sometimes you just emergency, we got to get everybody in a room.
Yeah. And in an emergency, inclusivity may not be achievable and may not be the top priority, for example.
Right.
Yeah. Which is not great, but yeah.
But if we've basically designed our interaction strategies with inclusivity as a part of the foundation, then it's not a matter of having to modify what we normally do. It's already part of sort of the DNA of how we come together.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't mean to discredit that at all. I was just thinking that, if sometimes asynchronous works fine, you have lots of time, everybody gets to weigh in. Sometimes you're trying to meet a deadline and you still want to be inclusive, but you just don't have the time to have alternating meetings, for example.
Right.
I'll give you a really stupid example. So the Research Data Alliance next plenary, we put in a session request with a group, and we had to do some revisions, and they were due on the 19th of January. I came back from holidays on the 19th of January, and no one had done anything. It was a tiny little change, which I thought no one really would object to. And all my collaborators were in Europe. So I thought, okay, I can now send an email to everyone asking them to weigh in on, is this okay if I change this sentence? Which means they get back to me sometime in the middle of the night, and then I still have to do it. And I thought, oh, I'll just send this and send an email saying, I've done this. This was a minor change. I hope this was okay. So that wasn't inclusive at all. That was, in fact, not inclusive. But I figured, if anyone objects, then they can change it in their time, but at least it's done. So it wasn't an emergency as such, but it was a situation where I thought, okay, I've thrown inclusivity and sort of cooperation overboard for this particular purpose. I wouldn't do that if it was anything important, but for this small bit, I thought I'll do it. But yes, I take your point that normally we should work with inclusivity as a backbone. Okay. Do we want to just have a look at what that could look like in a spreadsheet and have a think about how we could fill that in?
I've put the spreadsheet in the chat.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think I have the link here. Now I'll have to see if I go to that spreadsheet. Can you still see that? Or do you still see my slide?
Now we see the spreadsheet.
Okay, cool. Now, this is probably a little bit small. So I encourage you, if you can, to go to the spreadsheet maybe on your own device. Let me know if you have any trouble editing this. Yes, Carl, I feel your pain. I've had that too. So one of the things that the thing that I added in column H is the suitable for, and that's basically, well, I think I should revert that to purpose. So one of the things I think that needs to be part of this framework is, as we've just discussed, what is the purpose of doing the meeting or the interaction or whatever? For some things, slow, as Mark said, slow may be fine. For other things, you will, like if you have to make a decision on something, you may have to have a lot of interaction between people, and that's different from writing a book chapter where you have time and where you can actually discuss things asynchronously over time and resolve things if needed with spontaneous meetings. So feel free to have a go at the spreadsheet and maybe type things in if you can. As I said, if you have problems with the permissions, please say, and I'll try to fix them.
One thing that struck me immediately after looking at it is I think we need to also think about what we mean by everyone, because the more people that we have engaged in a specific need to meet grows exponentially the challenges for scheduling. So being very intentional in terms of being able to identify, whether it's participants in a particular working group, and that smaller working group may still have its own challenges in terms of scheduling face-to-face or asynchronous working timelines. But I think what we mean by everyone who needs to be participating in a particular activity or session, I think is a critical dimension that we haven't really we've sort of worked around the edges of when we talk about sort of time zone focused, groups that you might have different groups from different regions of the world meeting in different times. But I think being strategic in who really needs to be participating in whatever exchange at that moment, and being thoughtful about maybe thinking about smaller working groups or teams who can address particular things that can facilitate more in-depth participation and engagement.
That's a very good point. Where would you see that as a separate dimension, or would that be part of things like either engagement or effectiveness or even efficiency?
Well, that's where it's almost another dimension, or just a best practice in terms of how we think about organizing our activities and our interactions. Where, what are the times when we want to have the whole group as a way to get on the same page collectively, versus when are we needing to work on a particular task or product, and that's going to necessarily be a clearly defined subgroup, and looking for opportunities to work in subgroups when it's appropriate and necessary to, again, try to mitigate some of these large group scheduling challenges that we have. It's not going to make it totally go away, because if we're successful in having global engagement and participation, then even our small groups may have participants across, the full breadth of global time zones. But at least it gives us one dial we can possibly turn.
I've just put a dimension in there called appropriate participation. That's not a good word, but I wanted to capture the thought. I don't know what to call it, but I'm not at my best right now at coming up with something. But feel free to change that in any way, shape, or form. And I've just put in who needs to be involved. And I think I think your point is really good, because on the one hand, it's who needs to be involved, and on the other hand, who shouldn't, and not for reasons of we don't want them to contribute or participate, but for reasons of not overburdening people who could be contributing at a different stage of this, if that makes sense.
I think Rudy's comment about, maybe there is that optional participation in the invites or planning. We maintain the openness that we want to reinforce, but we also recognize that, folks would appreciate knowing if their attendance is optional for that meeting that landed at 3 a.m. in their time zone.
Yeah.
I think, sorry, just a quick comment. I think that might be a category, or that might not need to be a separate column for assessing the positive and negative, but maybe a more descriptive comments suitable for what different types of the online gatherings or engagement, right? That I think in some of the meetings that I attend, they will say this meeting is informational. Basically, just if you cannot attend, just watch the recording or watch the notes. That should be sufficient. And then if there's a meeting that's decisional, which means that involves those really action oriented activities. So I think maybe that can be summarized into what those different types of the meeting models propose on the first column, in those like suitable like columns specifically. Like this is a mix, like how good for how many people, for what types of the activities for that.
Yeah. I was just thinking, so in a completely different context, yesterday we talked about the RACI model, which is who is responsible, accountable, needs to be consulted, needs to be informed. So that may not be the best way of looking at it, but that might be a way of working out who should be in the meeting and who could be optional, or who could be who could be involved at a later stage. I don't know. It's just a thought. Leslie?
I'd like to also say, I said that one of the drivers was, how, if we're going to do ESIP Europe, one of the drivers of the session was, well, how are we going to actually manage it within the clusters? But another personal driver I have is in standards development, and just picking up on what you said about what we're actually doing, and it's subconscious. We're not realising. I've had a few complaints about this from the Global South, that these in-groups are forming from US, Australia, Europe, that also happen to be the ones that are setting global standards. But we're not moving mountains to help, say, people from Africa and South America. And if we want global data standards, we really need to say, look, hang on, we have to have representation of all the continents. And I would argue, if you look at most standards or protocol setting groups, it's US, Australia, Europe, predominantly.
Canada.
And this is something in Canada, something we need to address. And that's why I get upset at some of these standards groups with their in-person meetings, because you just about automatically cut out half the world.
Yes, Rebecca, that's a very good point. Do we have international, which means some countries/regions, or do we mean really global? And that is actually a bit of a beef I had with the Research Data Alliance, that has a very large membership, but it's got a very heavy bias towards the North and the West. So while Australia is a bit of a strong contributor to the Research Data Alliance as well, a lot of other countries in the Asia Pacific, or in Asia and the Pacific, are not included. And I know that there were a lot of effort was made to try and get other regions like Africa and Latin America in as well, but it's hard, and it tends to be something, oh yeah, we should do that, and then it just falls off a little bit as well. So I don't think it's sustained in the way that it needs to be. Yes, and we haven't even talked about language, bandwidth, etc. That is a very good point.
Yeah, but I guess first you've got to get them in. And yeah, it's interesting what you say about RDA, because you all know I do a lot of work with CoData. They seem to be really good at getting Asian and African participation. And so that's why the joint meeting with IDW and RDA, I always like that, because that's got IDW. So IDW has RDA and CoData, WDS, and we do tend to get a fairly serious global participation when we do that, but it's not sustained outside of how often is that IDW?
Every 2 years.
So every 2 years, yeah.
Well, I think maybe that's an action to talk to CoData in more detail about what they do and how they do it.
I think a lot of it's subject matter.
Okay.
I just note that we only have 6 minutes left, so if you all
yes,
sort of wrap up everything.
Okay. So my suggestion would be for everyone on the call and everyone else who is interested in this, have a look at this. Provide some comments, if you like, in the notes, and feel free to fill this in a bit more and let us know what you think. So that would be, I think, really useful for us. Let me just see if I can go back to my slides. Sorry, I'll just stop sharing for a sec. I have to find my slides again.
While Stephanie's doing that, I guess we just, for a wrap up, which I think I was going to do, this was, if you like having a BOF at RDA on a topic. I just want to know whether you feel we need to more seriously consider and develop this, or whether we just sort of have this as a one-off. And certainly what I will undertake to do is to get the list of tools. I've already added Fathom to the notes and see if we can add some more of those AIs. But yeah, I guess what I wanted, as a group, in the 4 remaining minutes, what do people think our key takeaways are?
Oops.
Well, so a takeaway for me, wearing my executive director hat for all of a week, but Douglas was also here and will be carrying this forward, thinking about how ESIP can collaborate internationally. And I'll talk more about this when we have the other international session later, but ESIP is often thought about not necessarily like establishing branch offices per se, but more about teaching people how to ESIP, because I think ESIP is a good forum for collaboration. This is my first time where I'm actually, running the Zoom and stuff for ESIP, and I was in another session earlier today, and a topic that I'm not terribly interested in, but there was no ESIP involvement directly in how it was run, and it was run super well. It was super organized. They had nice collaboration. They had clear next steps. So what I'm thinking, hearing this conversation, is that maybe ESIP needs to figure out. So I think we've established a nice culture of how to do good online meetings, how to facilitate collaboration. We're always looking to improve that, but there's that culture there. This is the same sort of thing. It's a different sort of culture, that is not inculcated into ESIP's culture right now, of working internationally, working globally means a different way of doing business. And that just needs to be baked into how you do things. And that takes time and training and facilitation, et cetera. But I think that if ESIP, my personal opinion, if ESIP wants to do that, that's what they need to be focusing on, not necessarily establishing entities around the world per se, more inculcating this inclusive way of doing things. And we have lots to learn from the Australians. It's not by chance that this is led by Australians.
Okay. Any other takeaway? We don't have to stick with 3. I think for me, one of the 2 takeaways would be it's worth exploring slightly different models like hubs in more detail. And the other thing is, I think, exploring AI tools and what the benefits and the barriers and the limitations are would be another thing, because I think Rebecca is right. There's a tremendous potential, but there's also barriers and issues with AI. So working out what could be done and how it could be done without being exclusive, without being problematic, might be a good way to go as well.
It's kind of like, a group looking at using AI to support to support meetings. What are the pitfalls, but what are the advantages? And I certainly haven't. I've been doing all sorts of things on AI, but I've never really looked at that specific thing. And I was really grateful to Jens for taking us, Steffi and I, through what he's using and realising, wow, this has potential. But buts were also coming up. And I don't know whether this could be something that ESIP itself, for the cluster meetings, like you save the recordings, is it time for ESIP to consider an AI support tool? Because like when I dial into some ARDC organised meetings, there's the Fathom buttons there, hit it.
So, Kate, I've just taken your comment and just mashed that into mine. Is that okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, Rebecca, that's quite right. We are used to long-haul flights, but it's just not practical, and it's not inclusive for people who can't do that for a variety of reasons. We're at time. So I was wondering, there is still an ESIP Slack channel that's called Australia Hub. I was wondering if that could be repurposed to discuss these sorts of things on an ongoing basis. I don't know, Mark, would that make sense?
Sure. You might want to rename it and re-advertise it.
Yep. Or is there any other way where we could continue the discussion?
No, I think
don't know enough about ESIP.
No, a Slack channel is great. Unless you want to establish a special cluster, that seems a little premature at this point.
Yeah.
So, and if you want to repurpose an existing one, or that's fine.
Or create a new one, or whatever works for people.
Whatever you.
Okay.
And I'll just throw it back to you. Whatever works for you, and just ping staff, and we'll help you out.
Okay, so I think that's what we'll try to do in the first place. Establish just a point where people can go and have a look at stuff, and then we'll take it from there and see if there's interest in having more of this discussion. So for those who are interested, please keep your eyes peeled. We'll try to set up a Slack channel over the next couple of days. Other than that, thanks everybody for coming. That was a really good discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Yes. At
Yeah,
whatever
this was
time might have been.
Small group, but I think that's because the world doesn't recognize the problem yet, which is part of what we're getting at.
Well,
but
and also,
as you say,
yep,
Australians certainly know the problem well, which is why we're here. Sorry, Stephanie, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's fine. I was going to say, and maybe more people will watch the recording because they couldn't make it to this particular session. So who knows?
It's true.
Fair enough.
All right. Thanks very much.
Thank
and
you.
thanks, Mark and Rachel, for your help.
Of course.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.